Welcome to Stoa Conversations. My name is Caleb Ontiveros,
And I'm Michael Tremblay.
and today we're continuing our series on Cicero's On Ends. We're at Book 4 out of 5, so almost finished. And Book 4, an excellent one. It's Cicero's attack on the Stoics. So, Book 1, presentation of Epicureanism. Book 2, the knockdown. Epicureanism is refuted. Then Book 3, we have which we discussed, the positive presentation of Stoicism, really a classic defense of the ethics, especially. And Book 4 is where Cicero says, I'm not a Stoic. Here's why.
Yeah, I thought this was great. I was telling you before we even jumped on, this was the most fun I had reading something in a while. I've read this before, but it is maybe if studying Stoicism is a journey and you like different things at different stages of that journey. Maybe when you start, you like introductory texts written by other people that kind of break down Stoicism. Then you get to the point where it's like, oh, your first time reading Marcus Aurelius, or maybe getting to an more academic book. This is like exactly my level of progress, which is like somebody who's well read in Stoicism, has tried to put into practice in their life, and is struggling with it a bit, but not from an Epicurean perspective. We'll get into it. But Cicero, they talk about the Aristotelian school, the Peripatetics, and their way to live as this counter to Stoicism. And yeah, it was great. It was like exactly the kind of questions that I think about and worry about. And so we'll talk about those arguments today. But I just had a blast reading it and seeing it presented so clearly. And again, very rarely do you get something this clear, knowledgeable that isn't academic. Like Cicero's still writing from the perspective of somebody who's trying to live it, but comparing these different schools. And I feel like that's almost isolated just to the academics nowadays. So really, really fun to read.
Yeah, absolutely. I think Cicero is a great example of the philosopher statesman, really, or which is to say, the kind of person who integrates philosophy at a serious level in their life. Whereas, of course, Cicero has a whole other life as an orator, plays a key role in the Roman Republic, really. So I think that's a good, nice. It's nice to have that existence proof as well. I think, which is that's possible to live the life of action while also taking time when you can to think through some of these, really challenging questions. And hear Cicero penning down what he thinks in this format of dialogues, speeches, and such.
Yeah. So, I mean, I structured this. I have kind of like a number of smaller arguments against Stoicism, maybe like sticks and stones. And then I think what I broke down to four substantive arguments against Stoicism that kind of build on each other. We could go through these one by one, or how do you want to tackle the chapter?
Yeah, I think that sounds pretty good. There's one key point you already hit on, sort of framing a lot of these arguments, that's worth discussing first, and we can jump into the uh, the arguments you've collected, which is that Cicero is sort of coming at this from the standpoint of an Aristotelian, or if not an Aristotelian, someone who's studied classical Greek philosophy and noted that a lot of these schools put virtue on a pedestal, but they don't go all the way that the Stoics do. They think virtue is necessary but not sufficient for a good life. Um, which is to say, it's one of the most important goods, if not the most important good, that one should be pursuing, but also granting that health, that's good. Reputation amongst people who are of strong character, that's also good, and in a robust way in which the Stoics deny. So I think that's sort of an important point to get at the outset, which is that's a lot of Cicero's arguments come from that starting point where it's like, all right, we agree that virtue is, if not the most important good, a good that's powerful enough to eclipse many of the things many people try to pursue in their life. But when it comes down to the disagreements between the Aristotelians and the Stoics, the Aristotelians' philosophy is just preferred. It's just better, not as absurd, doesn't play with words or what have you. So that's just my one introductory remark. What do you think about that?
Yeah, no, you're right. It's how do we knock down Stoicism? Well, it's not that Stoicism is bad per se. It's just it's worse than the Peripatetic school, the Aristotelian school, and Cicero provides this almost developmental picture of philosophy. So first you had Socrates and Plato, and then you had Aristotle, and then you had the Peripatetic school, and then Zeno of Citium, the founder of Stoicism, came along, and he took up this tradition and he deviated. And it's interesting because Cicero tells this. We normally tell this story from this um, Cynic tradition. Zeno learned from the Cynics, and Cicero focuses on actually his lineage with Polemon, who was the leader of the third successor of Plato's Academy, and so does this life cycle of ideas, having Stoicism emerge from this tradition, from the Platonic and the Aristotelian tradition, and then basically the argument is like, well, it doesn't actually improve things. It
Mm-hmm.
confuses things. It makes them slightly worse. And look, I'm not going to say a Stoic is a terrible person or it's a incoherent way to live, but you've just taken something and made it slightly worse, and then carved it off as its own school. And it's like, why not just do the original, better one, the Aristotelian idea? Is the argument, and that's a really interesting argument, and it's a very compelling argument, right? When somebody comes and says, "Well, Stoicism's stupid," it's like it's clearly not stupid, but there's an opportunity cost to practicing Stoicism. It's the way you live, and so I find the much more compelling argument. Well, that's a great way to live, but there's this slightly better way to live, and so why would you ever choose Stoicism? That to me is a much more compelling argument for giving up Stoicism.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, it's coming from a stronger position in a way. If you're listening to this podcast, you probably found a lot of value from these Greco-Roman philosophies, and a lot of the arguments for, say, virtue ethics or such might be good against different modern schools of thought, whether it's utilitarianism or just maybe modern versions of what we might call Epicureanism, hedonism. But then I think Cicero is pointing a challenge, which is, all right, we agree that these other philosophies are bunk. Now, why didn't you just stick with the classics? Why don't you just stick with Plato and Aristotle? Uh, so,
Yeah.
and I think that's where we're at. So we should get into these arguments. I'm interested to see how you formulated them.
Yeah, well, so I wrote down. I was writing them down as I go, and then I've got like kind of the big four, but there's some weaker ones along the way, which is I've wrote as on short form. Stoicism is confusing. Stoicism is not inspirational. I think this one is actually has some more weight to it. This idea that it's maybe it doesn't have to do with the actual content of Stoic philosophy, more the way that it's presented, which is that they try to convince the intellect but not the heart. It's not actually a good school for inspiring people or changing their way of acting, which is kind of an interesting argument. I mean, obviously, we've seen Stoics can be inspirational, but this appeal to the intellect. There's this criticism that Stoic science is general, whereas the Peripatetic school has all this great particular knowledge. It's got stores of facts about animals, um, and those I think are kind of weaker points. But argument number one is that Stoicism derives from the Peripatetic school with very minor changes. We've already hit on this a little bit, but I think that's going to set up the rest of the arguments, which is that you're already really, really close to the Peripatetics. And so you spoke about it a bit already, but the Peripatetic school is the Aristotelian school of thought, and it's a virtue ethics. The idea is the goal of life is to achieve eudaimonia, it's to flourish. And then the question becomes, well, how do you flourish? What is the good life like? And for the Peripatetic, it involves virtue necessarily, but then it also involves other things that satisfy the rest of our nature. So a social connection, a reasonable amount of physical security and comfort, good food, a place to sleep. These are the kinds of things that you measure up when you're measuring a good life. And so that's argument one, is that there's a very small difference. It doesn't knock down Stoicism yet, but it builds the rest. It's that there's a very small difference between the schools. The only ethical difference is the movement of indifference from good things to preferred. Or, in other words, the Stoics take what they call indifference, these external things, and they say, no, they're not good things, like the Aristotelians would call them. The Aristotelians would say, well, money is a good thing, it's just not as good as virtue. And so I shouldn't become a terrible person to make money. But if someone offers me money, yeah, that's great. Like I want money. And they take that good thing and they call it preferred instead. And then the other part of that argument also is that makes no functional difference. The
Mhm.
Stoics end up saying that these things are preferred. And so, if you look at the Stoic walking down the street and you look at the Peripatetic walking down the street, the Stoic's going to go around and they're going to select money, they're going to select friendship, they're going to select food. And the Stoic is going to say, well, I prefer these things, where the Aristotelian, it's almost like an argument from simplicity. The Aristotelian has this really simple argument of like, well, these things are good, so I want them. And the Stoic has to have this more complex argument of like, well, they're not good, but I prefer them because I select them in this case because nature has deemed that these are selectable in this instant. And I guess that it's just this argument of like, you've made this small change. It makes no functional difference to how somebody walks around and lives. It just confuses and complicates things. I would say that's really argument one, as I saw it. What do you think about that?
Yeah, it's probably get into this some more, but in a way, Cicero's arguments have a common theme, perhaps, of saying it's almost like a dilemma. It's the Stoics are either playing with words and making no functional difference to the life of someone who's already a peripatetic or attracted to this philosophy, or they end up saying some kind of things that are absurd. So maybe we'll get to that other issue more in some of the other arguments. But that's one way I've sort of understood the general thrust of Cicero's case. And to some extent, I think it is compelling. And sometimes we might talk like there's more of a difference between, say, Aristotle and the Stoics than there in fact is, because Aristotle says in order to live a good life, you need some amount of bodily health, riches, reputation, and so on. But at the same time, of course, Aristotle values virtue and doesn't say things like you should sacrifice courage in order to become rich or something of that sort. It's not that kind of
Mm-hmm.
philosophy. And on the other hand, the Stoics often will they'll agree with many decisions that an Aristotelian might make. So yeah, if you can pursue wealth, then you ought to do it, or at least it's something you can do if it's not something you ought to do. So I think there is that point, but and then there is something to it, I would say, but ultimately it does seem like there is a substantive difference in how the philosophies view what's required for happiness, and that's going to influence how the people think about their lives. If you see pain as an obstacle to happiness, at least a potential obstacle, then you might live differently than someone who is more stoic and sees that as
Yeah.
ultimately something that's out of one's control. So there certainly is something to it, and if you meet someone on the street who's an Aristotelian, you're a Stoic, you have more in common than 99% of humanity, perhaps. So uh, yeah, I suppose there is that, but uh, in the end, I don't think it's just. In the end, there are some differences that are going to come in how you think about your life.
Yeah, when you said that, it reminded me of like whatever the phrase is, like we got 99.8% of the same DNA as a goldfish or something. When you meet an Aristotelian on the street, just remember you're 99% the same. Don't focus on the 1%. No, you're right, and I was thinking about that. I think the difference is whether how stoic you are in like a trivial sense of the term, or not trivial, but like a non-philosophical sense of the term. Because I was thinking, what's the difference between the person who thinks money is preferable and I will pursue money insofar as it's available to me, to the person who thinks money is good, but it's much less good than courage, justice, temperance. Well, the difference is that the Aristotelian has a reason to be sad. They have a reason to be angry. They're wronged when someone steals their money. They're harmed when somebody insults them. And that's going to make a substantial difference, I think, to kind of your emotional life. And as you said, how you think about your life. Agreed. I think Cicero is kind of playing a trick here. Well, in all these cases, he's playing as characters and underselling that difference.
Philosophy of emotion is a great example where there's a functional difference. Aristotelians will defend anger and grief in some forms, of course, whereas Stoic, the Stoic case is ultimately against anger of any sort, and uh, against, of course, Seneca has a line, "You may weep but don't wail," but there is a sense in which the philosophy is against any kind of avoidable grief, certainly.
Yeah, agreed. And I think, well, I'm trying to make the argument that that's for the reason that, yeah, because the Aristotelians have a reason to be angry. Somebody did a bad thing to them. Somebody harmed them, and the Stoics are just never going to make that claim. And so it's not just, well, the Stoic is different on the torture rack, but the Stoic is and the Aristotelian are the same in the office place or at the sporting event. It's not the case. They do have genuine reasons to be different, in how they behave and act, as you called out.
Absolutely, that's well put.
The other argument that Cicero goes into, so we've established there's this small difference. So it's like, why even do the difference at all? Why even bother? Just, why do you go through all this work, when you got a perfectly good peripatetic philosophy right here? Then the second argument he makes is that there's a poor reason for the difference. So the difference has a poor philosophical foundation, and this is the one that I find the most compelling, of the arguments. So the Stoics downgrade externals to indifference because they downgrade the body. They reduce our identity to the mind. And this is something that I push for and I talk about a lot, is like, it's really important to think about the dichotomy of control, what's up to us and what's not up to us. This idea that other people can't harm you. It's really important to think about that in terms of identity. People can't harm you, as Epictetus says, because you are not your body. You are your mind. We talked about this a lot, Caleb. Your decision making thing. So a good life is one of virtue because that's you fulfilling your function. This is not what the Aristotelians think. The Aristotelians think you are a complex organism that is part mind, but also part body, part social connection. They take a more holistic view of yourself. You are harmed when somebody cuts off your hand. You are harmed when somebody steals your clothes and you're cold, because this is harming your body, which you're also a part of. You're also part of your social community and things like this. But the Cicero's argument, which I think is a good one, or I think one that the Stoics need to have at least a good argument for, is like, why reduce the concern to just the mind? You claim to want to live in accordance with nature, but nature clearly shows the importance of the body. No other philosophy does this. No other philosophy rejects the body in this way. And even if you take a developmental picture, which is the one the Stoics do, they make this argument of there's different kinds of beings and rationality is the best. So, the dog is different than the human. The dog should care about the dog's body, but the humans have an access to the divine. We're more intelligent, so we just care about the mind. And he says, why not have this conception where you just add faculties? Yeah, um, we can do things that the dog can't, that the animals can't, but we don't lose that animal part of ourselves. We just become a more complex thing, says Cicero, which is the Aristotelian argument. We've got this vegetative aspect to ourselves. We got this animal, appetitive aspect to ourselves, and we've got this rational aspect. But we're not, just because we have a rational doesn't mean we lose these other parts of ourselves. We've got to protect them with the mind. And I thought that was yeah, I'm interested in your response to it, because I think I think in all philosophy, or in all of at least ancient Greek philosophy, which is most of what I engage with, this to me is the most compelling anti-Stoic argument. Why this focus on the mind? Why this rejection of the body?
Yeah, there's a great line that Cicero just states what you summarized. If man consists solely of a reasoning faculty, let it be granted that the end of goods is contained in virtue alone. But if he has a body as well, the revelation of our nature on your showing will actually have resulted in our relinquishing the things to which we held before that revelation took place. At this rate, to live in harmony with nature means to depart from nature. So he's talking about, the Stoic developmental picture where you realize you're a rational being, but then on his view, abandon, these other things you thought were good, health, pleasure, potentially, and such. So the Stoics on this view get human nature wrong, I suppose, is the fundamental critique. The body matters. The fact that we're reasoning creatures, but we're also reasoning social embodied creatures might be one way to put it. And if you just focus on reason, you'll be missing out on the obvious fact that it's good for us to be healthy. It's good to be embodied in physical contact with others around us or something like this. We're not just disembodied minds. So
Yeah. He also makes
yeah.
I just found the quote. He also makes an argument which I haven't heard before, which I think is a really compelling one. We often the Stoics talk about pain as being an external, that's an indifferent. And Cicero makes the argument here almost that pain is internal. It's like a part of the mind. So I'll try to find the quote here. So, even if we were not seeking the chief good of man, but of some living creature that consisted solely of a mind, even so that mind would not accept the end of yours. For such a being would ask for health and freedom from pain, and would also desire its own preservation and security for the goods just specified. So I love this idea that even if you had a disembodied mind floating through the world, it would be like, I don't want to be in pain. I don't want to be unhealthy. So this framing of like health and pain and pleasure as being somehow external from the mind doesn't even work, even if we just identify just the mind. I don't know if I've heard that argument before. I think that's a really cool one.
Yeah, I suppose the thought is if you can experience pain, then it's bad for you or something of this sort, which I think makes sense if you think they're independently possess value. Yeah, I think let's get some of the other arguments on the table too. I think this is a good one, but I wonder before we respond to it or
Sure.
think through it, we should get some of the other ones on the table.
Well, I have two more. The third is that indifferents are conceptually weak. So they force either a movement towards Aristo or Aristotelian to make readings to make them coherent. There's a lot built in there, but basically it's like you've got a double value system where you've got virtue and vice, which is good and bad, and then you've got indifference, which are preferred or dispreferred. It's better to either move, which is overly complex and it's kind of incoherent. It's better to either move towards indifference as having a small contribution to happiness that won't overcome virtue, but still are a small contribution to happiness nonetheless, or to think of them as without value, which is the position that Aristo takes. We have an episode on him where he says basically, no, it doesn't make sense to talk about preferred indifference. You've got every decision is made in the moment. It's an expression of virtue or expression of vice. And so that's I think argument three is that you can't sit here with preferred indifference. You either need to go Aristotelian or you need to get rid of them altogether. And then I think argument four was that the natural conclusion of indifference is not the one the Stoics want. You end up like Aristo. He's basically doing a pro Aristo argument, which is that if you don't accept the Aristotelian position, I mean, this is, I guess, a continuation of argument three, but if you don't accept the Aristotelian position, Aristo is right. You have to go in his direction. And if you do that, you end up with all the reasons you criticized Aristo for, which is that you have no way to make sense of what's right in the world because virtue is supposed to be about selecting between indifference. It's supposed to be about using indifference as the material of virtuous choice because you understand what nature sees as preferred and dispreferred. And if you end up going Aristo's way and the only things that have any value are virtue and vice, then it's like a reductio ad absurdum argument. Like none of it ends up making any sense. And so that's the kind of, I guess the play is Cicero forces you to go, nothing external has value or things external have value. If you want to be anti Aristotelian and go, Nothing external has value. Then you end up in Aristo's position, but you already have really well articulated the criticisms of that position, Stoic school, and you've already shown why that doesn't work. So you're kind of stuck.
Yeah, nice. This made me think that it's a pity we don't have Aristo's writings, because it would be it'd be fun to read more about not just his criticism of the Stoics, but how he thought about the his philosophy in general. So of
Mm-hmm.
course we do have it secondhand from several sources, but yeah, it's a pity we don't
Not the
have a.
most charitable sources, even
Yeah,
here.
that's right. Yeah, they're always using him as, if you were, your philosophy is wrong because it's too much like Aristo's. That's usually how it's used.
Yeah. Ouch.
uh, yeah, so I suppose condensing those two arguments into one, it's a dilemma where the indifference, either if they make a difference to your life, how well they go, you sound like an Aristotelian. If they don't, then you're back in this land of Aristo, maybe some of the cynics. Right? You think wealth doesn't matter at all. We talked a little bit about the Aristo option. So maybe like one way to put the criticism is that from the Aristotle side, or from that horn, is which is you say health is preferable. What grounds that? What makes it preferable? The fact that an Aristotelian would say the fact that it has value, and the fact that it has value, going back to this second argument, is that you are a physical being. It says something about your nature that it serves, that it fulfills.
And not to cut you
So
off, but it
go
is
ahead.
the same argument the Stoics make. The Stoics think it's preferred because of its connection to your body. They just think that connection to the body is of a different value type. Anyway, I'll let you keep going, but it's like the Stoics still connected to the body. They just don't think it counts as good.
Yeah, that's right. They think that's what makes it preferable, but not what makes it good. So that's I suppose that's the challenge that he lays at the feet of the Stoics. Um, and I think the let me see if I want to read some more lines about him that capture this well. I think this is slightly not the exact same argument, but he also has some good lines about, the Stoics don't, this line about preferred indifference and such isn't a natural way of speaking. It kind of sounds like playing with words, but perhaps a deeper objection sometimes is that, we naturally speak like things, uh, like exile, receiving a bad diagnosis are bad for us. So, why not take that at face value? So he has this few lines. Could an advocate wind up his defense of a client by declaring that exile and confiscation of property are not evils, that they are to be rejected but not to be shunned, that it is not a judge's duty to show mercy? Or supposing him to be addressing a meeting of the people, Hannibal is at the gates and has flung a javelin over the city walls. Could he say that captivity, enslavement, death, loss of country are no evils? Which is just to say, I think in an ordinary life, we act like so many things are evil, good, worth pursuing, worth avoiding. And, the Aristotelian view best captures that because they have some form of value, whereas the Stoics ultimately almost, parse that language as, oh, it's preferable, dispreferable. That's it. Uh, but what's the motivation for that at the end of the day is what Cicero is saying.
Yeah, and just to pile onto the Stoics here with this chance we get, because after this it's back on the pro Stoicism bandwagon. But it's like, and this is the school that talks about being natural. This is the school that talks about living in accordance with nature. And so it just makes it a little bit more absurd than if they were like, well, we got this, like, they've got to explain why everybody got confused. Oh, you got confused at some point thinking Hannibal coming in and enslaving your entire family and killing you terribly was a bad thing. You got a bit turned around along the way. Let us put you back on the natural path. Um, And there's just there's a bit of, yeah, as you said, a bit of silliness in trying to be like, it's very unintuitive, right? It's very, very unintuitive, and for the school that claims to be natural,
Yeah,
where
absolutely.
the Aristotelian position is like, hey, look, that sucks. It just sucks less than being a coward and like running away and leaving your family. So you should probably stay and fight, or something along these lines. And you end up with both people staying and fighting, but one person you're accepting the situation as being terrible. Um, and in Stoicism, you're not.
Yeah, this reminds me that there's a philosophy professor I know who thinks most modern Stoics are really just Aristotelians and wearing Stoic clothing, I suppose. Which there's something to that. I think probably some popular Stoic people are Aristotelians, and there is always that. I think that, Aristotle's got a plausible view, so there's some amount of agnosticism even the converted have, perhaps. Uh, but yeah, is this a part where we defend a Stoicism against Cicero's attack?
I mean, we can try. Let's take on that challenge. Of how we would defend the Stoics. It's tough because
Nice.
these are what I think are the most compelling arguments.
Yeah, I think
Basically,
that second that. Oh, go ahead. Sorry, I interrupted.
no, what I think are the two weakest part of Stoicism. Like, he has other arguments that I think are less. We call them like substantial versus non-substantial. Like, another non-substantial argument, which I agree about, but doesn't really do any damage to Stoicism, is he's like, it's kind of stupid. You think there's no moral progress, and that like nobody's, only the sage is virtuous and everybody else is equally wicked. That's just kind of dumb. And he's like, then you'd have to say Plato was just as vicious as, this terrible person. And like, I don't know, that's a fine argument. Or like, I'm happy to entertain it, but it's not substantive. The two substantive arguments for me in all of Stoicism criticism is the question of identity. Why do we disregard the body in favor of the mind? And then what follows from that is the question of indifference and not giving value to them, when we could have this like slightly modified picture where we give them some value, but just a proportionate amount of value, right? Like, get angry, maybe never angry, but grieve the right amount. Be excited the right amount. Don't grieve in a way that is disproportional or unrealistic or places too much value on what you've lost, but grieve enough to recognize the bad thing that happened to you appropriately, accurately, and proportionally.
Mm-hmm.
That to me, and if that's the Aristotelian position, those for me are the two biggest things I wrestle with the most. So we were supposed to defend, but I just want to clarify that I think he nails for me the two biggest issues. And I'm not sure if you have a response to either of those. I can always try the Stoic line, but I do want to sit with those a bit longer as being pretty compelling.
Yeah, we should. I think. I think the second argument, this argument about identity, and perhaps this related argument we sort of put in the same bucket, which is around emotional, almost like emotional. I suppose it's ultimately the same kind of argument, but Aristotle thinks your emotion should fit the world in a way, and sometimes grief, anger are appropriate because certain facts about the world are tragic. Certain facts about the world are worth getting angry over. And perhaps, we could bucket those in the same kind of argument, because ultimately that comes down to, what kind of being we are, and the Stoics getting that wrong on the Aristotelian account. But yeah, I think that this argument of identity is a challenging one. The argument about indifference, I'm generally a little less persuaded by, but we'll see if we'll see how you respond. Maybe we could start there and then find our way back to this issue of identity, because that is a challenging one. So I think what Stoicism has going for it is really a clean, logical, systematic picture of what we are, what virtue is, and how virtue relates to happiness. And in particular, thinking about virtue just as this character trait about knowing how to manage impressions, which ultimately is, being knowledgeable, being able to act on that knowledge. And indifference are, what you're deciding between, of course, is the Stoic line. It matters that some are preferred or dispreferred because that's how you make decisions. And what happiness is, what virtue is the ability to make excellent decisions over time, act with knowledge and such. A few different ways of stating that. But that's why there's sort of the goal is just on being able to, think well, to come to true judgments and make, good decisions. That's the purpose of human life for the Stoics. And these indifference, they aren't valuable in and of themselves. They're just things that help make a decision good or bad. So to some extent, it almost seems like Cicero forgot or de-emphasized some of what he explained in the previous book about the role indifference plays and their relation to happiness and virtue. So yeah, what's your response there?
I mean, I guess I swing back to the Aristo position, which is something along the lines of why do we? I mean, I'm just trying to think of like why do we assume these things have this kind of like good or bad content to them, or what grounds their good or bad content? If I'm a mind who's supposed to go around seeing things accurately, that makes sense to me from kind of an epistemological perspective. I don't want to be deceived,
Mm-hmm.
but how are we getting the preference there? And I guess, it's no more complicated than how are we grounding the preference if not in the body? And they're going to say something like, well, we are grounding it in the body. It's just not as important as the mind, I guess. I mean, it's that gap there of like, where's preference coming from? Yeah, sure. If we're a mind, our goal is to make good decisions. We make good decisions using the material of the things around us. We decide based on the situation we're in. How should I treat other people? What should I do with my day? How should I act? But what's grounding the value of that material you're working with?
Yeah, I suppose if you say leave aside the second argument, say we our mind, we identify with the hegemonicon or the prohybris, what have you. That's what we are, and but we also are embodied and are making decisions about normal human affairs, and it's I think this is where the sort of the rules or heuristics or the fact that it's better for organisms to be happy, not in the sense that it makes them live a happy life or not, but that's what organisms naturally prefer is health. So there is maybe a sense in which the Aristo contrast is interesting because the Stoic challenge for Aristo, of course, is that if there are no ways in which things are preferable or dispreferable, then on what basis are you making a decision? And I think, Aristo's sometimes in modern philosophy call it particularist. Like he thinks you size up the particulars of a situation and then just make a decision. And if you're virtuous, you'll know what to do because you are good and you'll identify what the good decision is in that particular situation without making any claims about what's natural or what sorts of rules there are. You'll just know, it'll be apparent to you. But I don't know. I sort of think I think it's natural to say, if Stoics love these game analogies. We go to a particular game. In general, it's better to score points in games. But of course, and sometimes the sacrifice plays are valid strategies, even if in the end, when you're playing a game, what you're trying to do is score points. And then I think what Stoics just see our role is to play well, because winning games, these games of life, that's out of our control. That's something external. So we should play well, but you can make sense of preferred versus dispreferred facts in games, and that's sort of what grounds decision. It's not like it doesn't seem to me like the best basketball player is following in the footsteps of Aristo or something like this, and they just recognize the particulars in this situation is to do this, or because
Yeah.
I'm an excellent basketball player. So I don't know. Maybe that's a little bit of a long-winded answer, perhaps, but
No, I mean, then when you give that answer, I just immediately rush back to the Aristotelian side, which is like, well, we make that heuristic because our lives go slightly better, even if it's a small amount, by doing these things. But that's where the game analogy really is. I'm not like fully convinced, and this is still something I wrestle with or struggle to wrap my head around. But it's clear it's clear nobody on the basketball court thinks putting a ball through a net is actually a good thing, and yet they're still playing their heart out. So it's like clearly, I think the game analogy is pretty strong because you get people really caught up in doing something that doesn't matter, but it's a context by which to do something that does matter, which is perform. Um, so it clearly works in a basketball game, as much as it seems I seem to struggle with the idea of it working in life too.
yeah, I suppose maybe the Stoics would say it does matter that the ball goes in the net, of course, but it's not something that makes or breaks whether a player is excellent. Now, sometimes you just do see these debates about famous sportsmen. They're awesome, but they didn't win any championships or something like that. And I think that sort of crystallizes, in a way, a disagreement between, it's almost a Stoic versus Aristotelian type disagreement. Wouldn't it have been better if this excellent player had more championship rings? Wouldn't that have cemented their legacy or somehow showed they were a more excellent player? And I think the Stoic answer is no, it wouldn't. Uh, that's just a different, winning championships is not an input into whether you're an excellent player or not, which I think in a way sounds like a funny thing to say, but in another way seems kind of obvious, where excellent player, that's the guy you want on your team. That's the guy who makes it more likely that you're going to win excellent championships, perhaps, but it's not a guarantee.
Yeah, I think that's a really good example of the Aristotelian versus Stoic conception of sport. Um, yeah, okay. I mean, really, what we're arguing for is just that it's conceptually possible. Whether it's true or not, is it conceptually possible? And I think I struggle with it, but it seems possible. And then the question is it true? And then that comes down to the identity argument.
Well, I suppose another uh, attack from the Stoics against the Aristotelians would be that the Stoic account is more coherent, because and in a way almost more simple, because the connection between happiness, virtue is clear. Whereas for the Aristotelians, they think there are different goods and virtues among those, but virtue is not sufficient for happiness, but it is a good that eclipses all the others. And then I think there's sort of a question really about how systematic the philosophy is, and how that, what happiness is, and how it, what even is virtue on the Aristotelian picture. And in some ways, I think some of the answers end up sounding a little bit too Stoic in a way, and help you slide into Stoicism, or they're just not systematic. Courage, being able to face obstacles with caution and bravery. That's what it is. But that's not really a systematic philosophical answer at the fundamental level. So anyway, I think that's an attack the Stoics might have here, where then it makes the sort of the funny things they say about indifference more plausible, because although it may
Hmm.
not be the most natural way of speaking it, happiness, virtue are aligned. It's about playing the game of life well, if you will.
So the
And
Stoic,
it's a clear definition about what it is to be a great, if going back to this game analogy, there's a clear picture about what it is to be a great player. Whereas Aristotelian, now there's like, how much do winning championships count versus their actual, perhaps, the actual skill in the game, how many points they scored, what's the actual picture.
Yeah, the Stoics can go. I mean, that's a great point. The Stoics can go on the offense and give the same logical fork to the Aristotelians, and look, you're trying to you're trying to seem so intuitive by giving all this weight to virtue, but if you give too much weight to virtue, you just end up functionally like a Stoic, and if you give too little weight to virtue, you end up looking like something not very appealing at all, or something that is maybe Epicurean without saying it. And so you end up in this kind of confused middle ground where it's ambiguous about who lived well and who didn't, as you said, who's a good basketball player and who isn't. There's arguments or confusions, um, where the Stoic has a much more clear distinction. It's like, this is the criteria: virtue. Did you achieve it? Did you not? And if you did it, and then some bad things happened outside of your control, well, I'm not going to think any less of you.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Cool. Well, so much for the third argument. I guess the second one is is outstanding. And I think when perhaps we've said a number of things in our conversation that address it in a way, and maybe some of these moves are familiar, but I think there is a way in which it's if you're a Stoic, even so, it is natural to almost slide into this Aristotelian picture. And perhaps if the worst you do is slide into Aristotelianism, that's maybe not such a bad place to end up. Uh, so I guess that's not. That's just to say that this picture that values virtue, but also recognizes there's a place for grief, for recognizing that you can be harmed by others, that the body's health fundamentally matters in some way. That's not a bad place to end up, perhaps.
Yeah. Well, sometimes I think about that. Like, I'm not sure who was the philosopher who said all the Stoics were Aristotelians? Who was that?
Oh, as a modern fellow, I won't name him. I think just for the sake of his privacy. But
it was too spicy of a take. What my thought with that is that, like, I think something similar, or I at least consider something similar, and then maybe it's the case where, like, if Aristotelianism is right, but we're so far from valuing virtue properly that if you shoot for Stoicism, you land in Aristotelianism. Like, if you shoot for Stoicism, you value virtue as the number one thing. You take it as more important than these other good things, but you don't ever really give up your you don't really ever give up your considerations for your possessions or for pleasure or the body. And so you end up with this really Aristotelian picture where you still value those other things, but you just value virtue the most. And so then maybe there's a picture there where if Aristotelianism is the right answer, maybe there's this benefit to practicing Stoicism because we're all so far from it, and it's such a difficult challenge even to get there, that it gives us, if we shoot there, we land halfway, and it's not a bad spot to be, as you were saying.
well, do you want to say about anything about the traditional move Stoics might make against this argument?
Against the identity argument?
Yeah, against the identity argument in particular.
I mean, I think the argument they're going to make is going to be one of hierarchy, right? Like, the Cicero appeals to nature. Well, it's natural that we have a body. It's natural that we develop these other faculties, but then should still care about our body. Every school, descriptively, every other school of philosophy does this. Why are you being weird? Why are you doing this thing other people aren't doing? And the Stoics, I think, are going to appeal to hierarchy. They're going to say, well, there's this part of you that's better than the other parts. It is more divine. It is more godly. It is more important. And not just a matter of degree, but a matter of type difference. Humans are not like other creatures there's a type difference that comes with being reflective, having the capacity for self-awareness, having the capacity for introspection. And so maybe a lizard is like a cat, and there's not a type difference there, but once you have intelligence, that is not the same as uh, you know a blind animal gaining the ability to see or something, right? Like, that's a new faculty. That when you gain self-awareness, that's not a new faculty. Like, a type change has occurred. And so, yeah, you should now identify with the top of the hierarchy. I think that's going to be the argument. Like you are a piece, as Epictetus would say, you're a piece of God in like a body of clay, right? Like he really emphasizes that difference.
Yeah, absolutely. I think so. And I think that perhaps to sort of justify this view about hierarchy more, in a way, it's sort of following a kind of philosophical tradition that thinks that ultimately human development is about mastering some of these lower appetites, what have you, some of these more animal instincts, desires, and such. And perhaps the Aristotelian picture sort of, you want to harmonize different aspects of yourself, roughly put. But the Stoic picture is, what the reason, we advocate this kind of thing is that, what you ultimately are is that harmonizing ability, that ability to make things intelligible, to make decisions, to see the world. And I think that's sort of that I think that picture has that picture is appeal just because it's connects to what you have control over. It connects to this picture of nature as a whole as being rational, and and maybe it makes more sense out of the Aristotelian. Yeah, I'm actually not quite sure how to put this, but this ability, this activity of being, this ability to harmonize different parts of yourself, that's what you
Mm.
are. It's not like there's these three different, you have a tripartite soul going to the
Yeah.
Platonic picture. It's
Another, I mean,
it's you.
another,
Go
oh,
ahead.
go ahead. Sorry.
No, so I suppose that there's this argument that the mind is unified, and if it's unified, the best way to account for that is that it's the the rationing part, the rational faculty, that's what you are. So maybe that's another kind of argument I was just gesturing at.
Yeah. Well, and then, I mean, I think this is getting what you're hitting on, Kayla, was that another way to think about what you are is the kind of thing that you can receive praise or blame for, the kind of thing that you can be evaluated for and judged for. And I think the Stoics, maybe that's another argument. You were referring to the appetitive parts of yourself or the non-rational parts of yourself, and there's this view that you can't be judged for these. Or you think about somebody being born with a physical disability and not just being like, oh, that's not just the Aristotelian picture being something like that's unfortunate, but this actual picture of like you're defective in some way, like you're worse, and that's something that the Stoics are going to reject because that's not you. And they're gonna like that. That's an incorrect way of thinking about things. I know I guess it doesn't provide an argument for it, but it provides a situation where it seems actually really intuitive. Because Cicero's almost making this argument from it not being intuitive. Like
Hmm.
we all think about ourselves as our bodies, but here's this argument for actually being intuitive to think about ourselves as our mind, which is like it's pretty weird to judge somebody. Uh, again, yeah, if they got sick or if something happened to their body, we might do it, but it seems weird, and also people tend to think that that's like not a good thing to do. It's not a correct thing to do. And I think that's the case when identifying with the mind seems very intuitive. I guess when we're like, well, what should we judge people for? What should we evaluate them on?
Yeah, I suppose that's where Stoicism is more egalitarian.
Mm-hmm.
Everyone has a chance for happiness. Whereas, the Aristotelian view literally is if you're physically deformed, you're not going to be as happy at the very least. You don't have the same shot at happiness as someone else does. Um, and I suppose that's sort of the other side of the coin of taking other kinds of goods seriously. If you think the health matters, then the lack of it is an obstacle to achieving happiness. And that's maybe in some ways that's intuitive. People would think, oh, of course I prefer being healthy rather than being sick. But in other ways, it's not intuitive just because we find so many people in negative circumstances who seem to have a kind of happiness to them. I suppose there's that point, in addition to the point that perhaps it's a mistake to judge those people as being defective in some way. I think there's also the point that you can read accounts of different people in terrible circumstances or who have physical deformities, but they seem happy nonetheless. So, what explains that? Perhaps the Stoics have a better account there.
Yeah. I mean, I certainly like the egalitarian one more. That certainly appeals to me more.
Awesome. Well, we've gone a bit over. Is there anything else you want to hit on?
No, just I think fun chapter. Good questions to think about.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's a great chapter. It really crystallizes some of those important challenges with Stoicism. So if you're reading along or not there yet, we highly recommend reading it.
Cool. Awesome. Thanks, Gil.
Cool. Thanks, Michael. Peace.
Thanks for listening to Stoic Conversations. Please give us a rating on Apple Podcasts or Spotify and share it with a friend. If you want to dive deeper still, search Stoa in the App Store or Play Store for a complete app with routines, meditations, and lessons designed to help people become more stoic. And I'd also like to thank Michael Levy for graciously letting us use his music. You can find more of his work at ancientlyre.com. And finally, please get in touch with us. Send a message to stoa@stoameditation.com if you ever have any feedback, questions, or recommendations. Until next time.